we should report the reality. And reality is complex and it's painful sometimes. Then again, it's very easy to talk about it. It's very difficult to do that when you're in a specific system, in your media outlet. You are a reporter, but you're also an Israeli or a Palestinian. And then you report about what hurts to you the most. And then you tend to be oblivious to the suffering of the other. It's very human, but at the same time, it's also very wrong.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast about the intersection of peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. As of this recording, Israel and Hamas are just over 2 weeks into a ceasefire agreement after 15 months of fighting. This is a difficult moment to even imagine the possibility of a long-term peace. The horrific October 7th attacks and the near destruction of Gaza that followed served to amplify already high levels of distrust, hate, and trauma. On the other hand, the war has demonstrated to Gazans that the government placed conflict with Israel above their own survival. And it has shown Israelis that an indefinite blockade of Gaza doesn't ensure their security. So while the ceasefire doesn't mean the end of conflict, it does give the people on both sides an opportunity to envision a way out. Our guest for this episode is peace builder and political analyst Ksenia Svetlova. Ksenia has her finger on the pulse of politics and media in the region and a unique perspective. She immigrated to Israel at age 14 from the Soviet Union. After studying Arabic in the Middle East at university, she worked as a journalist for 15 years. Ksenia reported from Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, and different countries in the region. She served 4 years in Israel's parliament, representing the center-left Zionist Union Coalition. Now, Ksenia is executive director of the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics, and Security, called ROPES. ROPES brings together young Israeli and Palestinian professionals with counterparts from other parts of the Middle East. Their ultimate goal is an interconnected, peaceful region, including Israel and a future state of Palestine. Our show's producer, Andrew Maraskin, spoke with Ksenia from her home in Tel Aviv.
Ksenia Svetlova, welcome to Making Peace Visible. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ksenia, I want to give our listeners a bit of a chance to get to know you before we get into recent events. You seem like a really interesting person. To begin with, you immigrated to Israel from Moscow in 1991 as a teenager with your mom and grandmother. You were part of a massive wave of Soviet Jews who moved to Israel around that time. And most of those immigrants became allied with the right wing, but you took a different path. Can you talk a bit about your story and how you formed your political identity?
Well, yes. I think that in general, the story of the Soviet Jews and their political orientation in Israel, it's a fascinating one. The first prime minister and the first party that most of the immigrants at the time voted in 92, it was Yitzhak Rabin and Labor. As for myself, I think my journey was a little bit unique indeed, because while in Israel, I actually studied in the religious school, and it was affiliated with the settler movement. I, of course, had no previous knowledge of what is a settler movement. I was not attached to any religious ideas, coming from a very atheistic society. But I always knew very clearly that I want to become a journalist, and I had a very deep interest in the Middle East. So I think that became the decisive thing in my life, because after school, I studied in Hebrew University, and I studied Middle Eastern studies, Arabic language, and journalism. I think that through study of the region, study of the language, getting to know much better, the political history of Israel, the Palestinians, countries around us, and actually meeting Palestinians and other Arabs as well. I think that slowly it took me to a very different place. And since I became a journalist after graduation, I worked as a TV journalist for almost 15 years, covering the West Bank, Gaza, and also Arab world. I think this very direct communication with it's completely got me into a new perspective about life here. So when I decided that I want to join politics and to be elected to the Knesset, my choice was clear. So I joined the center-left bloc, the Zionist Union, and was a member of the Hat-Noah party. And I think that this is the only natural choice. The party that believes in two-state solution wants to find a path to communication and integration here in the Middle East instead of forever wars. And I stand very much behind these ideals also today, also after 10/7.
So why do you think you were so interested in the Middle East? Even as an undergraduate, you already had to learn a second language, Hebrew, coming to Israel. You didn't have to learn Arabic. Obviously, Israel is in the Middle East, but a lot of Israelis don't like to think of it that way. So what sent you in that direction?
It's interesting. It started in somewhere in my childhood with the fascination of Egypt, ancient Egypt in the beginning, and then modern Egypt. I was completely smitten. My father was an art critic. I grew up basically in museums and between art exhibitions and so on. One of the books that influenced me, it was a book about ancient world and specifically ancient Egypt. So when I came to Israel, I knew much more about Egypt, both ancient and modern, than about Israel. It was actually quite funny. It was curiosity, first of all. I think that also in my school, when, they tried to basically indoctrinate us about, how the other hate us. And yes, indeed, some people hate us, but definitely not all. And that there is also nothing there. There is no culture. There is nothing. And I felt that it's just not right. There are fascinating cultures beyond the border of Israel, also inside Israel, because also Israel is multicultural and we have 20% of our population Arabs who have Israeli citizenship, and about 50% of the Jewish Israelis came from the Middle East. So I think that it's quite natural for the Israelis to speak Arabic. I promoted a bill in the Knesset so that the Israeli children would study Arabic from first grade. Unfortunately, it didn't go along very far. I was in the opposition. But with time, I think that it's quite clear. We do not understand much our neighbors. We have to understand them much better, and not from the position of superiority, people study Arabic in army, but they do it only for military purpose. This is something that killed me always. Like how people don't want to know how people next to us live. How do they look like? What do they take interest? What books they read? So as a journalist, I try to bring these voices to expose more, the Middle East around us. And I hope I succeeded.
Ropes is what I would term a peace-building organization. You spoke about curiosity of the other. Was the desire for peace with Palestinians, was that always a driving force in your life, or is that something that, came out later?
Well, when you live in Israel, when you live in Middle East in general, you cannot not think about peace and the absence of peace every single day of your life. As a teenager and then as a young woman, I lived in Jerusalem. And it was in the time of the Second Intifada, when buses blew up next to me. And in the midst of the Intifada, I was going to Ramallah, I was going to Gaza, I was talking to the people. And, I met so many people who were people just like myself. I met fathers who buried their children, who died, as a result of airstrike. And airstrike came because there was rockets that were fired on Israel. And these fathers told me, listen, we just want our children to be the last. One of the fathers in Beit Lahia told me specifically during an interview after he buried his daughter, I don't want any retribution. I want my daughter to be the last victim. And I think that, seeing it, experiencing it firsthand, and feeling the pain of the both. Because when you feel the pain of your own people, well, it's natural to identify, with your own kin. But when you are going to the other side daily, and you see what's going on there, and you see the checkpoints, and you see the occupation, we control their life completely. And you see, what is going on the other side, with all of the problems, with all of the prejudice, with all of the bias, with all of the pain and humanity as well, then you get a totally different picture from what you would have if you would not have this exposure. It's priceless. So I think that the desire for peace, it was shaped during these years, during the years of the bloody years of the Second Intifada, incursions, military operations, blood. I saw so much blood, also on the streets of Israel, but also, being in Gaza, in the West Bank and so on. And then you understand, so an eye for an eye tactic will everybody go blind eventually. It will not bring peace. So this is something that defined me as a person and also, as an aspiring politician when I decided to run for Knesset.
So you served in the Knesset in Israel's parliament from 2015 to 2019. So what did you learn there about the practical obstacles to making peace, and how did it inform your approach towards peace building?
I think that, these years were definitive because they led to what happened in 2023, this assumption that existed in the Israeli right that in order to stop from Palestinian state to exist, every strategy is good enough, even if it means that you have to strengthen Hamas, the enemy of Israel, but at the same time, you have to weaken the PA. So I saw it and I couldn't believe it in the beginning because, I didn't cover Israeli politics before. I was aware of, the general positions of the parties, the leaders, the blocs and so on. But I saw in 2015 how Netanyahu launched this unprecedented campaign against Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of Palestinian Autonomy. And he hailed this man as a partner for peace just a few years earlier when he hosted him in his official residence in Jerusalem. They met, they hugged, he also hugged with Arafat, and so on. It was clear to me that it's so cynical, that there is very powerful settlement lobby. This lobby promises Netanyahu political survival as long as he will allow them to continue with the construction of settlements and as long as he will prevent the two-state solution. We are talking here not about security. First and foremost, we are talking about cynical political interests. I can just say that it was the most interesting experience perhaps in my life, but it was also one of the most frustrating one because it was quite clear that the propaganda of the right wing and even I would say extreme right wing about the Palestinians, about perspectives of just continuing ruling them indefinitely and so on, it also got to the Israeli left. Even to raise the awareness about that became incredibly difficult. And I can tell you that the Israelis who are fighting for peace today, they are brave people that have a lot to lose. It would be just easier to just shut up about the whole thing. But no, we have a lot of people, journalists, peace activists, politicians, many others, who still continue to speak about what's right. And what's right is that we have to get to some kind of agreement, with the Palestinians. It has to be a just agreement. It has to be a secure agreement. It might take time, but eventually that's the only horizon that we have.
I just want to clarify something that you said. Were you saying that the right wing and Netanyahu were contributing to the growth of Hamas on purpose?
So Netanyahu, when he was first re-elected to the prime minister office, first time after 10 years of absence, he won the elections in 2009. And his motto during these elections, his election promise was, we have to topple the Hamas in Gaza. But then something happened that I definitely didn't expect, and nobody expected that Hamas became kind of a partner for Benjamin Netanyahu. After a few years in power, he realized that, the Israeli people do not want another war. Short military operations, it's one thing, but a prolonged war like what we have now in Gaza, this is something very different. And therefore, when Hamas was in dire need of funds because the Palestinian Authority refused to send funds to them because of the internal dispute, he basically pushed for the agreement between Hamas and Qatar. And I was astonished at this moment. It seemed that he was willing to do everything to make them survive. And even though, the attacks on the Israeli cities continued, Hamas was burning the fields in the kibbutzim near the border. And we knew about the underground tunnels that they were building, and there were tons of indicators that they are not just want to rule Gaza. They wanted to attack Israel from Gaza. I made a few speeches in the Knesset. I wrote a few articles about that. Hamas is befriending Netanyahu, and Netanyahu is befriending Hamas. It's unimaginable, but nevertheless, this is true. At the same time, he waged the war against the PA. He waged the war against the moderate factor in the Palestinian society. That was the Abu Mazen, the Mahmoud Abbas, and I saw that this policy turning into this divide and rule, preventing from the Palestinians ever to unite, preventing from Gaza to be free from Hamas. He thought that he could get away from this. And then 10/7 happened.
So now let's talk about the time we're in. We have a ceasefire. And, it seems like an appropriate time to talk about peace when there's a ceasefire. But the kind of peace that your organization, ROPES, and other organizations like it are working for is something else entirely. So what's the difference between a ceasefire and peace?
We experienced many ceasefires before. Before the war of 10/7, what we had is ceasefires between military operations. And it was always very clear that, Hamas will violate it, that there will be some security threat. And in the end of the day, nothing is resolved. I mean, I know that Hamas, they have very cynical interest in their mind. And, their idea is not the same idea that we have and also the Palestinian administration has and many other Palestinians. But nevertheless, with Hamas existence in Gaza and the right-wing Israeli government, it was clear that, these military operations and in the end of that war will just perpetuate themselves. So you can have ceasefire, but it's just a short break between, the military operations and conflict. So what we need is something different indeed. In ropes, we believe our philosophy is that Israelis and Palestinians, we cannot reach any kind of agreement today in a bilateral fashion without deep involvement of the region around us, without involvement of moderate Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, the neighbors of Israel with whom Israel has already peace agreements, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, everybody who is there today talking about the need to de-escalate, the need to provide a real solution for the Palestinian issue. I think that we need a very close circle, of course, with the United States as a broker, but also with regional actors that should be the guarantors of both security and prosperity. The prospective integration of both Israel and Palestine, independent and viable Palestine, in the fabric of the Middle East, where many countries now realize that it's much better to have peace than to fight. We have peace agreement with Egypt that perhaps it's a cold agreement, but it's standing for 45 years. We have a long-term agreement with Jordan. We have now 5 years almost of Abraham Accords. And we could have so much more if together with the region, we would concentrate on providing a real solution for the Israelis who needs their security and for the Palestinians who need their state.
What's your sense of public opinion in Gaza right now? Is there the same level of support for Hamas that there was before the war? Do you think that Gazans want Hamas to continue governing the Strip or somebody else?
Well, for me as a journalist who always relied on direct communication with the people, it is always very difficult for me to just trust, like what other people say or what some polls say and so on. In my understanding, the support is much less than it used to be. But since Israel didn't use this 1 year and 3 months of war in order to work on a decent solution for the Palestinians, on what should happen after the war. So today, if the ceasefire will hold, if the hostilities will not be renewed, it means that effectively Hamas is still in power. So whether Palestinians in Gaza support Hamas or not, they still will be living under Hamas rule. And if there will be no other solution, meaning I think that the only possible solution is basically the return of the Palestinian administration, a reunification of Gaza and West Bank, and the very close involvement of Egypt, United Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and other countries also as peacekeepers, and also, of course, as supporters of Gaza reconstruction. That's the only thing that can work.
So there's a very strong push in the Israeli public to get the hostages back. After they've been returned, do you think the Israeli army will resume the war in Gaza?
With every day that passes, I think that the possibility for that is very slight, because we have now 500,000 Gazans who are now back to northern Gaza, and we have relative calm, in the area. We have now also Israeli reservists that are coming back to their houses, to their businesses, to their lives. Some of them served for 300 and even more for 400 days in the reserve. So the appetite for that in Israel definitely is very low. And the pressure from the American administration to cease the hostilities is clear. And it was expressed very clearly to Netanyahu.
So let's talk about Donald Trump. He had his people working in Qatar on the ceasefire agreement in the weeks before he took office for a second time. How much do you think the timing of the ceasefire had to do with Donald Trump?
Of course, we don't know everything, but from the open media sources and from the leaks that we heard, it seems that Trump applied pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, also directly through interviews that he gave since November, and also by sending his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who met with both Netanyahu and met with the families of the hostages. And apparently, according to the reports that were published in Israel and in the US, he demanded very clearly to stop the hostilities and to implement the hostages deal. So this is something that certainly derives from the power of Trump and his special connection to Netanyahu. Things that Netanyahu was able to say and do to President Biden and before him to President Obama, he seems to not dare to act the same vis-a-vis Donald Trump.
Do you think there's any way a second Trump administration is actually good for long-term peace?
I think it's still early to tell what kind of effect will Trump's administration have on the prospects of achieving peace, because we do hear conflicting statements from President Trump himself and also from his team about what does peace mean. So, for example, we did hear from President Trump on certain occasions a statement about the relocation of the Palestinians away from Gaza to Egypt and Jordan. Well, this idea is being discussed by extreme Israeli right for many decades, and it's called transfer, something that the Palestinians definitely would not choose, but something that, some people who are racist and who do not wish to see any Palestinians here, not in Gaza and not in West Bank, are dreaming about out loud. So it seems that someone of them got to Trump, and then we heard this kind of idea, okay, so why not to relocate Palestinians? By now it was already Indonesia, Egypt, and Jordan. And all of these countries, to my knowledge, said that they are not interested in that. And also, of course, not the Palestinians themselves are not interested in that. So this is something that can potentially destabilize the region and also, the security in these specific countries.
Let's talk for a moment about the media. I heard multiple times during the war that Israelis were getting a very different narrative than most of the world was seeing. They were shown very little of the suffering and the loss of life in Gaza. At the same time, 159 Palestinian journalists were killed in Gaza, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. And the Israeli government shut down access to Al Jazeera in both Israel and the Palestinian territories at different points during the war. And of course, you were a journalist for 15 years. You watched the news very closely. How would you describe the impact of the war on the news ecosystem on both sides?
Yeah, well, let's make an order there, because there are different issues and some of them are indeed controversial, while others are more kind of clear. I will start with Al Jazeera, which has an immense power on not only, among the Palestinians, but across the Middle East in general. I'm talking about the Arabic language. Al Jazeera, this channel always used to be divisive, controversial. It was banned in many Arab countries years ago, also in the Palestinian autonomy itself. It used to be banned for periods of times. During the beginning of the war, this channel became a microphone to the Hamas. There is no other way to explain what is Al Jazeera. It shuts down, Palestinians who are speaking against the Hamas in Gaza. It takes them off the air when they are giving answers that are not pleasing to Hamas, to their representatives. And also many journalists, apparently, that, some of those who were killed and some of those who were arrested actually belong to the armed wing of the Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So they were both journalists, but also both members of the armed organization, which is designated in the US, in Israel, and in many other countries as a terrorist organization. So I would say that just like European Union that blocked Russian TV channels from air, news websites and so on, because they seeded disinformation, fake news, a lot of hate. I do not see big, problematics with blocking away the poison that is being spread by Al Jazeera. It's distorting the news. I can tell you that because I'm, always making this comparison to other channels in Arabic, there are much, much more balanced reporting on the war, specifically also on Gaza, that doesn't hide away, the suffering of the Gazans, because it's real and it's true. And the world should be aware of that. But at the same time, it also exposes the cynical abuse of the civil population by the Hamas. For example, Saudi, Emirati Al Arabiya, Sky News Arabia, and there are tons of other channels, Al Hura among them, it's American, and others that are doing much better work. But Al Jazeera is, for many reasons, is the most important and influential of them all. So that's about Al Jazeera, and I can tell you about, in general, about distorting the news. Well, unfortunately, in Israel, the media system, the mainstream media, basically, rallied around the flag, of course, underlying the suffering of Israelis, and there is suffering, and there is human loss of life, and there are hostages, of course, still in Gaza. And there are soldiers that are being wounded or killed, but there is very little coverage of Gaza itself. And unfortunately, I can tell you that it didn't start with the war. For years, Gaza was sealed to Israeli journalists, I think since 2007. The last time for me to visit Gaza was in 2006. Of course, it's taking a toll on honest reporting and availability of information and so on. So this is something that, it's unfortunate and it should change. So both sides have a lot of soul searching to do. And that's why, Rope's mission is so important. We try to bring together journalists and we talk with them about how we can combat fake news and disinformation. How can we also humanize the other side? How we can get away from this, rallying around the flag. We should report the reality. And reality is complex and it's painful sometimes. Then again, it's very easy to talk about it. It's very difficult to do that when you're in a specific system, in your media outlet. You are a reporter, but you're also an Israeli or a Palestinian, a Gazan or a Tel Avivan, and then you report about what hurts to you the most. And then you tend to be oblivious to the suffering of the other. It's very human, but at the same time, it's also very wrong, according to the journalist standards.
So let's talk about Ropes, your NGO. As you said, you do trainings with journalists. You also bring together other professionals, not just from Israel, Palestine, but from other countries throughout the Middle East. Why do you think this kind of regional collaboration is valuable?
Well, I believe that the regional collaboration and regional integration, when people will be able to really get to know each other, get to know the perspectives of each other, the human life conditions. For example, in our seminars, when Israelis hear that in order to get to Cyprus, Palestinians need to travel sometimes for 3 days, because they need to travel through Jordan, because there are closures and because the border is open just for so many hours. So, and they need to spend, a day in Jordan sometimes to get to the airplane and so on. They are shocked. They just don't know this reality. So I'm saying that, there are many valuable things. You get to know each other. You get to talk about bias. You get to talk very frankly without fear of, being criticized and so on, because you are in a very unique situation there. And we have very organized group process that we do to discuss narratives, to discuss life conditions, and to discuss the future. Because we pick individuals to participate in our seminars, individuals with a vision, individuals who believe that the future can be different from the present and especially from the past. And while past is important and we have to acknowledge that, we cannot also allow to the past to dictate everything that can happen in our future. So we in Ropes believe that only through these very strong ties throughout the region, Israelis and Palestinians and Moroccans and Egyptians and Emiratis and Saudis, can we get over the insecurity, lack of trust, and to understand that we have a region to run here. And we have to provide for better conditions for us, for our children, for the future.
I've heard you say before, I'm sure you said it many times, that Israelis and Palestinians or Jewish Israelis and other Arabs, they're not as different as they tend to think. What are some of the things that are shared? What are some of the connections, similarities?
Yeah, well, I have to tell you that when you get these groups together and you look at them, first of all, like even visually, we are very much similar to each other. I have to remind that, that half of the Israeli Jewish population, they actually came from the Middle East. And those who did not, there has been a mix-up, marriages and so on, so you don't know anymore. You have people who have joint Libyan and Polish heritage, for example. You have Palestinians who live now in England and who are married to British, and their children will be half British, half Palestinians. This is, just the superficial one. But in the inside, I can tell you that, the experience are very close. We experience pain. We are living in the violent region. We are subject to violence and trauma. And I can tell you that during the war, we had one of our seminars that was focusing on humanitarian aid to Gaza. In the midst of the war, there were Palestinians and Israelis and Arabs from across the region sitting together and thinking how we can work out the regional structure so that the humanitarian aid will be more precise, that it will reach people who really need it. We had somebody who survived the war in Gaza, who were able to leave Gaza just in time before the border closed. for many, many, many months. And we had one of the participants was a guy who lost his both parents on 10/7. So we are speaking, about joint pain. And then you understand, that the person, next to you is feeling this pain also. And when you are, talking about common traditions and you are talking about common dreams, so then you understand that we are sharing this region, we are sharing this air, we are sharing this land. And there is no way to just close ourselves with walls and to say, well, I'm living on an island. I don't care what is happening with anybody else. There is a distinct feeling among these groups. And this is the outcome of their meetings, that everybody has to win or nobody will win, because there cannot be a situation in which just Israel will win or just the Palestinians will win on the expense of the Israelis.
So before we close, Ksenia, what do you think is a viable next step for Gaza? What would you like to see happen?
So listen, there are many scenarios. And the more optimistic one, will have a continuation of the ceasefire, release of all of the hostages, and then the surrender of the weapons by Hamas. We do hear from the leadership of Hamas in Egypt and in other places that they understand they are not able to run Gaza. They should not be allowed to run Gaza because this is a key, for disaster. They run Gaza for 20 years. This is the result. On the other hand, I think that the ceasefire will only last if the current Israeli government will be dissolved, because I do not see how you can accommodate the most extreme right wing that exists in Israel with the need of continuing with the ceasefire and rebuilding, restructuring of Gaza. Or when, these people are dreaming of banishing Palestinians from everywhere and to just move them to Jakarta or to Jordan or to Egypt and whatever. So these political processes should start now. I hope that they will start soon. And this will enable a more moderate leadership to come to place in both Gaza, in Palestinian autonomy in general, and in Israel. And then we have to start from scratch. With the help of the region, we have to talk about tomorrow, how the future for Israelis and Palestinians should look like. What do we want to build here? For the last 20 years or so, there was no strategy of how the next day should look like, what we are seeking, what we are looking for. My hope and my dream is that along with the release of the hostages and, the stop of the hostilities, you will have also the beginning of the political dialogue that is so much needed. And the media that played a huge role, for example, in the Northern Ireland conflict, because it embraced the Good Friday Agreement and it supported it, because it understood that it was the only chance for peace. And the media can play and should play a huge role also now by embracing the most moderate parts of the society, finally voicing out what they want. They want peace. We want peace. We deserve peace.
Yeah, I hope this will be an opportunity for a reset. Thank you so much, Ksenia. It was really illuminating speaking with you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you as well. Thank you.
You can learn more about ROPES by visiting ropes.org. That's ROPES.org. You can also find their podcast, ROPEScast, which is hosted by Ksenia, wherever you're listening to podcasts. The Making Peace Visible podcast is produced by Andrea Maraskin, who also contributed to today's interview. The associate producer is Faith McClure, and I'm Jamil Simon. If you appreciated what you heard today, we would appreciate it if you'd spread the love. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, give us a rating and review. If you're a Spotify user, you can rate the show or leave a comment on the episode. If you listen elsewhere, please share our podcast with a friend. Thanks so much for listening and talk soon.